we go to the stream? Yeah. You can start now.
Okay. I'll take POIs in chat. Content warning. The speech will contain mentions and even some descriptions of the war crimes done by the United States. I feel like that should be par for the course for such a motion, but just to say anyway. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest export of the United States is war crimes, and the head of that company, the CEO, should be subject to the same punishments we levy against the dictators of third world states whom we are all too willing to punish, but for some reason are willing to turn a blind eye towards the biggest exporter of such war crimes. First, on some procedural matters, there are two concerns that may arise on the procedure or legitimacy of such a prosecution. First, isn't the United States not party to the Rome Statute? We have three concerns with this. Number one, you don't need to sign to be prosecuted. Number two, these are indeed extraordinarily serious crimes. And number three, these crimes were done on the grounds of many ICC ratifying states. The second procedural concern is, well, what about complementarity? Well, shouldn't the US be in charge of prosecuting these presidents? Number one, the principle of complementarity only works if the state is willing to prosecute and indeed has the capacity to. Number one, there is a genuine and stolid unwillingness for United States courts to prosecute these people. Number two, they're unwilling to because of various immunity mechanisms, as well as just the bribing and the control that they have over the judiciary simply means that many of these people will not be prosecuted unless we have an external international body doing it, which would be the ICC. Having said that, then, we will run three arguments in this speech. One, that they deserve to be prosecuted. Two, that you have better foreign US policy. And three, that you have increased support and funding for the ICC. Let's get into it. Number one, they deserve to be prosecuted. So, I'm going to explain some of the war crimes that they've done in order to show that there is a genuine principled justification and, in fact, an overriding principled obligation for an international body that claims to uphold the state of human rights in times of war in many of these countries to hold the United States to that same standard. There are about 6 things that they've done that, can be categorized into 6 things, rather. Number one, the use of indiscriminate weapons like drone strikes against civilians in Pakistan and Iran, like the use of white phosphorus munitions in the Syrian civil war. Secondly, attacks on civilians, airstrikes on hospitals, firing into crowds in Haditha, in Baghdad. 3, the command responsibility of contracting with groups that have known war criminals, like Blackwater, funding other terrorist groups or dictatorial governments that themselves do these war crimes, and otherwise enabling the existence of war crimes in these areas. Number 4, the war on terror, the prosecution and use of arbitrary detainment in Iraq, for example. Number 5, the torture of people in Abu Ghraib, sleep deprivation, waterboarding, the use of foreign CIA black sites with the express intent to torture people beyond the bounds of state law. And 6ly is just fabricating pretenses to invade, falsifying the legality of an invasion, like playing up ghosts of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. These are extraordinarily egregious war crimes, paid in the cost and the blood of hundreds of thousands of people, whether directly under the United States' bullets or indirectly through the lives destroyed by the people left behind, by the economies destroyed, and by the fabrics of the culture being ripped apart in many of these countries. These are extraordinarily egregious crimes on the scale of vulnerability, on the scale of largeness, and on the scale of gravity. We wouldn't let dictators go just because it's inefficient. We don't think it should make any different just because it's the West, and in particular the United States, doing these crimes. So even if this makes the ICC marginally less efficient, or maybe they have to spend their time and money on this case, we think this is an extraordinarily important case to prosecute, and we think it is justified for them to prosecute. Secondly, we think there's also a better US foreign policy. Currently, the United States acts with impunity. They're willing to engage in indiscriminate military tactics, proxy wars, and other war crimes because it is simply cheaper. It is, one, more efficient to take down large areas, even if it means some civilian casualties, if you just carpet bomb various places and just hope that you hit the hospital. Number 2, it's cheaper to use drones and airstrikes rather than troops on the ground, despite the fact that a surgical knife would avoid more war crimes. And number 3, it's easier to conduct within a 4-year election cycle, which means the likely effect of such a deterrent external to this, as well as the express credible signaling effect of being willing to prosecute further United States presidents in the future, is that future US presidents, both because of the threat of punishment as well as the overall loss in popularity this causes, the damage it would do to their campaign, their re-election chances, the chances of their party succeeding, would simply mean that the United States presidents of the United States would be far less willing to engage in actions that could be misconstrued as war crimes or just directly do war crimes themselves. Why is this good, and what are the alternatives? Number 1, they're far more likely to pursue diplomatic means, which is just a lot better because the United States has often acted unilaterally without the input of communities in the countries that they invade. But secondly, it also means that they're more likely to avoid the escalation of conflict in the first place, being more willing to defer to trade sanctions and other similar means. The second thing is that in cases where they are forced to use military means, 1, they're less likely to use drone strikes, they're less likely to use indiscriminate airstrikes, they're less likely to bomb people from afar, which means that they're more likely to have less war crimes, you're less likely to have bad actions in crime. But secondly, you're also more likely to ensure innocent civilian lives are not lost. You're less likely to have arbitrary detainment. You're less likely to have actions of torture. And in situations where there is even evidence that they're hiding something, are far more likely to be engagements or inquiries into these things, which means that there's also enabling the capacity for things like independent media, journalists, evidence gathering to actually be of use against the United States. Which means the alternative is a far more accountable United States, one beholden to the rules of international law that they themselves helped set up. This argument is important. Number one, because of prospective justice. We prevent future war crimes that ensure that conduct of war is more respected, less people live deplorable and inhumane lives under the hands of United States torture. Number two, this also means hundreds of thousands of people's lives are safer because the United States is less gung-ho about starting wars in countries that they don't face the consequences of, because now they do face the consequences of it, or at the very least the commander-in-chief, who's making most of the overall executive decisions, is now facing the consequences of such a thing. Which means that more people's lives are safe, even if they're not directly affected by the torture, but they would be indirectly affected, their lives are also improved. And thirdly and lastly is that they're the far more vulnerable people. We have an obligation to make their lives better. This clearly makes their lives better because the fact that most of these people reside in developing world countries, which the United States specifically targets for like resources or whatever. So then I will move into an argument about how this increases support for the ICC. But I just want to note that these two arguments already are sufficient to win the debate, both on an independent principle justification, but also just ensuring that we have more prospective justice. I'll take a POI from CO now.
Yep, so you haven't actually linked any of the atrocious things you're talking about to any US presidents at all. The people involved, like soldiers and military commanders, were prosecuted and found guilty in the US.
Number one, command responsibility, which is that they ordered these things directly. Number two, that they let these things happen. That number three, they were negligent when these things happened under their control. Number four, that they made overt promises because they knew that this was happening and they made overt promises to shut down these things. And yet evidence is showing that Obama didn't actually shut down Abu Ghraib, didn't actually shut down the Bagram air base and so on. So all these things are still happening. And beyond that, like many of them just directly ordered these things. Like this isn't really the biggest contention in this debate. I don't think anyone's going to say United States presidents are not at some degree involved in these war crimes. And we're also willing to include the soldiers themselves individually in this prosecution. Lastly, we also increase support for the ICC. A lot of countries in the ICC are leaving or losing faith. What we're really losing is small countries like the Philippines, South Africa, the Gambia, Uganda, Burundi, and Burundi did indeed leave because these are countries that are losing faith in the capacity of the ICC to be, an actual bastion of justice, for the reason that the biggest exporter of war crimes never gets punished, never gets held to account. And we think these are countries where we need the ICC the most, where courts are weakest, where they're most in need of evidence gathering, and where they're most likely to fall into conflict. This means that they are far less likely to be able to do their job in the places where we need them to do their job. And beyond that, we don't think Western countries are likely to leave anyway, since it would be an admission that they themselves are war crimes, and they also want the US to be held accountable. At the end of this speech, it is clear, on three independent reasons, principled, practical, and it's a rather really good practical one, we should evidently win this debate.
Oh, thank you very much to the Prime Minister, and I'm happy to call the Leader of the Opposition.
Okay, am I audible?
Yeah.
Cool. Amazing. Let me just set up my timer. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. History repeats itself in a time again on an ICC-esque motion with David and OG. History also repeats itself in that David's preemptive is again insufficient. True, the US does not need to be a party to the Rome Statute for the ICC to prosecute. This doesn't mean as a consequence that the US is going to extradite or cooperate. They already do not today. There's a number of structural reasons why that's the case. First of all, they're too big to fail. Like, what the fuck is going to happen to them? They're the biggest military in the world. They're the biggest economy in the world. They have an influence here which includes the entire world. Who is going to sanction the US and how? They can act with impunity. They already do. David proved this by listing the examples of situations when they did. Secondly, no US president will want to be the one to allow this because this can happen to them tomorrow when they engage in certain situations, as David said, which can be misconstrued as war crimes. Note, it's a very strong signal. These are presidents on both sides of the political spectrum, both Democrats and Republicans. You never know when the winds of change are going to happen, when the perception of something that used to be a freedom intervention and seen as that in 2001 is going to be seen as a war crime in 2022. You want to not to do this a priori out of risk aversion. Thirdly, it's seen as a sovereignty breach. Sovereignty is seen as the ultimate manifestation of American freedom and liberty. Not all of the symbolism of liberty in America, the dollar, the Lady Liberty in front of New York, the colonial heritage that they talk about that is inspiring them, the idea that we left the British in order to be able to be free in our own country. Nobody wants to be the administration that signs off on this because it's seen as being a sellout. It's seen as being a weak America. No, the final president, the last president who won before Biden, won on saying make America great again, despite the fact that he was an idiot. Very strong political message not to do this. But fourthly, American citizens will not want to equate their presence with fucking Saddam Hussein. They will think not only this is an admission of an American loss, but it means we're admitting that we're on the same level as the Taliban, on the same level as the terrorists. It's immoral for any president to do this. There's no electoral incentive for any president to cooperate, which is why the US, as David helpfully points out, already hasn't ratified the Rome Treaty and doesn't cooperate despite condemnations, not just by the ICC, but by other more important institutions like the UN. They simply don't give a shit. All of the faith in ICC material is contingent on the US actually cooperating and not on the US showing that they're too big to fail, that they're bigger and different than everyone else, which means that more countries will leave. But the comparative is not just the US. Other countries will have a problem with this because they're going to think that they're next in line. Because so far the trend has been we don't prosecute Western people or Western aligned people, as David said. Israel is going to have a problem with this. Serbia is going to have a problem with this. Everyone who did controversial things will have a problem with this. What is the consequence? More countries leave the ICC, less faith. There's less cooperation with ICC investigation. There's less pushing countries in their diplomatic sphere of influence to join the ICC, but it also means that lower level cooperation won't happen. Israel won't extradite Netanyahu, but they do extradite soldiers. They extradite lower level generals who actually commit war crimes, which is probably the most important mechanism for victim closure and anything like that. They're less likely to do that when they're no longer in the ICC because now Bibi fears that he's going to be extradited. So they get less of all of their mechanisms on their side of the house. The only comparative is some weird sort of symbolism, which I'm not sure is relevant in this debate. But even if this is an efficient institution and efficient prosecution, first of all, I will contend the point of culpability. I don't think they're culpable to the extent that they need to sit trial at the ICC. First of all, they did not act on their own behalf. They had advisors and stuff like this, but secondly, the fucking Senate who voted on this and the people who voted that Senate in, which meant they had a democratic but also legal obligation to act in this way. Secondly, they acted under time pressure. You are reacting to one of the most stressful historical traumatic events, 9/11, the Twin Towers crumbling down in the middle of New York. You don't have time to think through, the best possible course of action. You go in because of an emotional response, an emotional impulse, but also because of the mandate of the people that demand this from you. But thirdly, most of these things, torture, massacre in Fallujah, waterboarding, were ordered by lower ranking officials, corporals, lieutenants. Presidents had no knowledge over this, but they as one individual also don't have the capacity to police every single military information. That's why, as David says, the chain of command exists. Information about a specific information in Fallujah is delegated from the corporal to the lieutenant, not to the fucking president of the United States of America, which means they had no knowledge nor capacity to stop each of these individual actions. But even if they did, this is zero sum with prosecuting the people who actually committed the crimes. First of all, because this takes a huge amount of political capital. The case is less long. ICC has finite capacity, finite judges. Huge amount of media attention on this. You are scapegoating a president to sit trial for the crimes of an entire nation. This means it's less likely, or at least it happens far later, that we actually prosecute the guys on the ground, which takes away from pursuing the principally more justified course, the ones who are more directly culpable, which is also better tied with actual victim closure. But this also happens for legal reasons. If you cannot demonstrate double culpability, if you want to show that the president is culpable, you need to show that he somehow coerced and led the soldiers into doing these actions, therefore diminishing the culpability of those on the ground who actually committed the crimes, which is to say, alongside our mechanisms, while you are less likely to get lower level extraditions, this means that the more important prosecutions are less likely to happen. The practical impact of this is less victim closure, but the principal impact of this, it is unjustified in terms of degree of culpability. So even if you don't buy why they're not culpable, this is zero sum and that's bad. But also a lot of things that David talks about are not consequences of war crimes. They're consequences of war. Economic devastation, collateral civilian victims, terrorists unfortunately using people as human shields. Yes, there is victims. Yes, there is death. War is not a war crime. This is not a burden that was made by government in this debate, so they already lose. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Yeah, lots of the stuff that you were saying can also be extended to soldiers on the ground. They didn't have time to think through this. They had an obligation to follow orders. All of that can be applied to other people. Just because it's difficult to prosecute someone, should they just not be prosecuted at all?
And it probably should be taken into account as an attenuating circumstance. A lot of soldiers who acted under duress were actually liberated. No Dražen Erdemović, who participated in the Srebrenica genocide because he acted under duress. This already happens in legal systems. I don't see the point of your POI. On American intervention, I don't think the consequence is going to be more detailed, nuanced intervention. The likely counterfactual is going to be no intervention at all. Because as Taha says, you never know when something is going to be misconstrued as a war crime. You never know when a lieutenant is going to go rogue. You never know when you're going to have asymmetry information, not know what's going to happen on the ground, and then you have to take command responsibility. It's too big of a risk for all the reasons David describes. I posit it's a bad thing, because American interventionism has often been the only vehicle of improvement of situations in countries where the government did not want to or couldn't protect its own citizens. The genocide, human rights breaches, horrible violations. In Iraq, yes, horrible things happened, but they got a stable government and a constitution. Afghanistan, horrible things happened, but they had a country that was actually livable. Serbia, horrible things happened, but Milosevic was deposed. But not that also in the meantime, America has been under huge scrutiny for its failures in these interventions. The fact that these kinds of crimes birthed other groups like ISIS, like terrorism in Libya, so they're already less likely to act to that extent because they want their interventions to be perceived as successful. What is the problem? At the point where we deter American interventionism, we lose one of the only vehicles in the international community that is willing to go into another country and establish a fucking democratic government. The United Nations Security Council has veto power. Somebody's always going to fucking veto. They can never agree on anything. Russia or China. NATO is only a defense alliance, which means that American interventionism is very often the only vehicle that we actually have to improve situations on the ground. I'm fine with more of it because the comparative is Saddam Hussein forever. Lastly, I just think this increases terror recruitment around the world. This is going to be construed, aha, you see, even the West admits that they're guilty. And then even worse, when this process fails, it's going to be construed as, look, there's a conspiracy. The West obviously won't prosecute the West. We have to take matters into our own hands. It is huge, huge push for motivation, for recruitment and stuff like this. More people are going to die for all of these reasons. Opening opposition has clearly won this debate.
Thank you very much to Leader of the Opposition. And now I'm happy to call Deputy Prime Minister to continue the round. Hear, hear.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yeah, all good.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The difference between this and the world final is that David is a more handsome deputy. 3 things. Number 1, will the US cooperate? Because they say none of the benefits will accrue because the US will not give the president up. I want to note, despite them not cooperating, and I'll prove they'll cooperate later on, they still get a lot of the benefits that we explained, because our benefits were largely on the ability for the US to change its foreign policy. And the reason that's true is because if you are accused of being a war criminal and you are continuously hiding from the trial, it is incredibly likely that this is going to be weaponized against you. It is incredibly likely you look like a coward or are deemed to be guilty because you refuse to show up to the trial. And therefore, the massive loss in popularity, the massive riskier re-election chances are incredibly likely to influence the future decisions that presidents make with respect to the kinds of foreign policy they take on. So even if you don't actually get them to show up and be punished, it is still an incredibly powerful mechanism we have on our side. Secondly, I think they likely will. 1, you have an opposing party that might benefit from the immediate re-election. And they say you don't know when the winds of politics are going to change. Well, if you are more concerned about the next 4 years, because that is the most certain thing to you, versus some speculative, we don't know if they're going to switch that against us, especially if you're just a congressman or a senator and you're going to be willing to be able to vote this in, it is much more like politically strategic for you to be able to do this. But secondly, all their mechanisms of being able to have these symbols of America, of freedom and of hope, are only true insofar as you have a homogenous America that agreed largely upon this. I would say insofar as there's increasing opposition to things like war and war criminals, i.e. Bernie Sanders within America, it is unclear why these are the same people that won't be willing to give them up. Secondly, they say non-intervention is bad. Firstly, I'll explain why a lot of the time intervention is better than no intervention. But even if that were true, I don't think our alternative was they will never intervene to begin with. We explained that either you take more careful methods of intervention, but if you believe that's too costly, we think you are still willing to do things like pursue diplomacy, because they don't explain why the US is suddenly willing to lose all of its foreign policy and soft power in the world just because they're too afraid to do a few things. In fact, I'd argue it is that middle ground between them being afraid of the consequences, but them still wanting some form of global influence, that forms of intervention are more likely to be better. 3 ways diplomacy is better. The first thing I'll note is a lot of US intervention refuses to negotiate with local governments, refuses to take in the interest of the people within the country itself, and therefore is more likely to lead to bad foreign policy. It is more likely diplomacy, where you need to directly work with the people that are there. You're more likely to strike a good middle ground. Secondly, it less likely escalates into conflict if you're willing to go in with boots in the ground and airstrikes because it's easier for you. But at the same time, that is more likely to ensure the other side is willing to clap back, send their own soldiers, start to militarize further. That increases the amount of conflict that occurs. But thirdly, you get less anti-Western sentiment because being willing to do things like negotiate, like fund some things, or being willing to create some kind of aid package is more likely to create amicable relations between the West and this country, and therefore a longer degree of trust, rather than the amount of terrorism that the war on terror actually created, which is incredibly counterintuitive to its goals. The rise of ISIS was a direct consequence of wanting to fight Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in the area. I don't think that was very successful. So given that, not only are the alternatives better, but having intervened oftentimes creates these sentiments for terrorists to continue to try and hate on America. Not because the ICC is punishing them. I don't think many terrorists are even very well aware of the internal mechanisms of the ICC. They're more aware of America's bombing their own civilians. Next, culpability. Firstly, a democratic mandate nor a stressful situation are justifications for war crimes. Like, this is just obviously true. So I don't think that is standing material from them. Secondly, the president is the chief in command with respect to war. So one, there is obviously direct command responsibility. We can hold soldiers that are on the bottom to some degree of account. That doesn't mean we should not hold people on the top. But secondly, that's why it's important that this is prosecution, not conviction. OG doesn't have to prove these people are guilty, but that there's enough basis to be able to pursue a case. And uniquely with prosecution is the information gathering mechanisms within the court, which are important because a lot of the time, the ways that things are decided in military are classified as military secrets, are classified as things that are supposed to be confidential. And therefore, it's uncertain whether or not from the outsider's perspective, the president had directly caused all the different war crimes, because we cannot know with the information we have unless we could legally force them to be able to submit that document to a court. And therefore, prosecution is crucial in that instance because you're letting many people go then. In that instance, then, this proof of culpability is either incredibly weak or one where this chain of command necessitates we gather more and more information about these groups. Lastly, more countries will have a problem with this. The first thing I'll say is that I disagree with this. In fact, I would make the argument that because other countries have been forced to be put into the mandate of the ICC, that they feel that they are restrained with respect to their foreign policy, but the US is unrestrained. Many countries who want to pursue a more independent foreign policy, who don't want to beg for the US's help every time they want to be able to solve a situation, are more likely to be supportive of this because they know that the US large, global dominance and power is the reason that they are constrained and therefore incredibly dependent on the US being willing to help them and therefore have to create more concessions in deals with them, etc. So I'd say a lot of mid to high level powers are more likely to be supportive of this. Secondly, I think the countries that we named are the ones where the presence of the ICC is the most important in this instance. And they've tried to leave because they view it as an an imperialist institution that's particularly persecuting people of their color and people of their race, and therefore have lost trust and are no longer willing to cooperate with it. This is where the ICC is the most important. I'll take a POI from OO. Okay.
They didn't neglectfully enable their generals to do war crimes. The fact is, they gave a lot of these generals to be prosecuted. I really don't know why they're to be blamed for what they did.
So my big question is, why is it that despite giving up some low-level generals, and this questions your benefit as well, of whether or not giving up some low-level generals is a big enough benefit? Because when you give up some low-level generals, one, I don't think these are the people that people directly know are responsible for a lot of war crimes. But two, compared to the face of a nation, quite literally, so there's more closure there. But two, and more importantly, this does not create the means for structural change. You can give up a series of low-level generals and commanders every single term within the US presidency, but have little to no changes in how interventive and how dangerous foreign policy can be. I'd actually even argue it's become more dangerous under Obama-era drones. I'd say the only way for you to actually change how war is conducted is not to put individual pressure on people that you can easily give up from time to time, but to ensure that the people who are deciding a lot of policy are more likely to be held accountable and therefore less likely to pursue the dangerous methods that they have. Again, I think if they say the ICC is so weak, it's not clear what marginal difference they're going to have on their side. Whereas on our side, we're far more likely to create meaningful change with respect to the conduct of war. I'm very proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now I'm happy to call Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close the debate on the front pile. Here, here.
Hey, am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, efficacy. Secondly, culpability. And thirdly, impact. Of course, if I'm starting this way, I also have to add, to win this debate, government needs to win all 3 questions. Opposition only needs to win 1. Why? If the motion is ineffective, this is already logically prior to anything else in the debate, and they just can't accrue any of their benefits, and they only get the harms of lack of cooperation from the rest of the world in other parts of future wars. Secondly, even if the motion is effective, if the people they are charging are not to blame, they are simply not justified in acting against them just because it has efficacy, especially when, note, we don't have the alternative of no action at all. We stand under our side, under holding the people actually accountable who actually did the actions. So we think that this is also sufficient. Lastly, impact. Even if they have efficacy, and even if the people they are charging are to blame for this, the obligation that we have then is to first protect their victims. And note, even if these people are to blame, they are already out of office. They themselves don't pose any more future danger. So their guilt is already less important than other harms insofar as they are indeed guilty. Cool, let's get to these questions. Rebuttal will be integrated. First, on efficacy. I think Tim did quite a good job here. They didn't get direct refutations, but rather competing analysis. I'll handle it now. First, we probably have a incentive as the party that currently runs against the current winning party to let them lose. I'm very confused by this for 2 reasons. The first is it's not a current president being charged at any point, but secondly, note, war crimes in the US are bipartisan. We got examples in the info slide of Obama and Bush, of presidents from both political parties. This means that you would need to get people from both parties conceding that their party stood behind war crime. So I don't know how this is an election incentive for them, unless in some way they can support it only in the case of Bush, but not in the case of Obama. I'm so confused. Bernie's voters are such a small minority. They didn't even win inside the Democratic Party. Come on. I really don't think they're a big swaying part in this debate. All of this doesn't engage a lot of things already coming from Tina as to why the mentality of the American people is not going to support this. We are told, if there's enough support from the American people to prosecute those presidents, then the parties will play along. Sure, but they won't have this support. They don't see their democratic leaders as equivalent with Gaddafi. They are likely to have the mentality of, America comes first and not be aware of even a lot of the harms that happen, because half of the Americans don't know how to place these countries on a map even, and because a lot of these people already lived when these actions were taken, most of them, in fact, it wasn't that long ago, and justified them and felt the immediate threat after terror came to America and the Twin Towers fell, and they felt that they have to act in some way. We really don't think it's likely to be a popular act, and this is why we don't think America is likely to cooperate. Want to point out, at this point, anything else said by any other team in this debate is logically not standing if they don't win on efficacy. Therefore, winning this question is already sufficient. Let's talk on culpability. So I think here, what do we get? First, conflation of democratic mandate with democratic obligation. Yeah, I agree that a democratic mandate is not what makes you allowed to do war crime. I think, however, a president is not allowed to just act on his own behalf against the desires of his party who was in the Senate, who were voted by the people. He is there as a obligational role. He has role fulfillment obligation towards the people. He is a tool. He is only there because they chose him to be there. He would not have had the power otherwise. And this means it's illegitimate to use it in ways that are opposing what the American people wanted. Secondly, it also meant that they just didn't know better, okay? Unlike most of the dictators that we charge that acted on their own behalf and did things of their own volition, when everyone around them told them they are acting on the right, they didn't have any other ways to know that they are doing wrong, especially when they are not responsible for many of these individual war crimes that happened by lower ranks without their knowledge. And when they knew, they did punish them. So I really don't know what is this neglect or enabling point. Lastly, I also want to point out that since, the act of war is not a war crime, but rather just a necessity and a country's sovereignty. Sometimes when fighting terror, a lot of these war crimes happen just because the war itself was a necessity, and then it becomes really hard because terrorists often use human shields. Often a lot of the local population is supportive of the organizations, etc. So these non-distinctive kind of attacks are hard to distinguish from the very act of war, which is obviously something a country is allowed to do. For all those reasons, we think that these are not the people you should hold accountable. Also note, Tin also proved why it's likely to make less accountability towards those who really made the decisions and had relatively more actual decision on this. CG say, they also were impacted by pressures at the time. We think that still, A, they saw more what happens on the ground. They saw the dead people, they saw the harms of what they're doing. B, they were more aware of these actions. They gave the direct order. C, they were acting on their own volition rather than based on what the Senate voted for them to do, because they were given a lot of autonomy during the warfare, and they decided to act this way. We think they are at least more culpable, if not fully culpable. Before I move on, can I get closing?
Yeah, you keep saying that the presidents aren't to blame and that the lower brass are. Could you explain why, absent any top-down pressure, the American military continues to carry out war crimes at such an astonishing rate?
I think because oftentimes people who join the military, especially those who get upper the rank in any military, I know this, I have a country with conscription, tend to have people with tendencies to violence who like killing people, because this is something that is often rewarded. I also think that generally speaking, when you are in the war, it's easy to demonize the enemy and get away from your liberal values back at home and not realize the harm that you're actually inducing. I really think there are many reasons that are not about presidents. Cool. Let's talk about impacts. First thing, weighing. When Tin proves that this is going to lose support, not only from the US, but from so many other countries, because almost any country today can be blamed for something dodgy, this is a bigger impact than anything any other team in the debate can prove. Why? Because this debate is one or a set of culpable people in one country out of all the different cases that we can have of things that the ICC can do. When we lose all possible ability to collaboration in the future, this impacts significantly more cases than just this motion and should alone win. Secondly, note how terror organizations themselves are able to use this to show, look, the ICC agrees with us, the West is the bad guy, and the West wasn't even willing to collaborate with them, which only strengthens their narrative to gain more support. For all those reasons, oppose.
Thank you very much to DLO. And now I'm happy to call the member of the government to open the bottom half of the debate. Here.
Hi, just want to check if I am audible.
Yeah.
Cool. War is really messy. You need to make quick decisions, and sometimes terrorists use human shields. Tell that to the 70,000 people who've lost lives in Pakistan because of the US war on terror. This motion isn't only just a motion, it is also a very personal motion, even that lots of the people around me have been affected by terrorism and US policy in some space or the other. So for side opening opposition to come up and say, there are some US interventions that are really necessary, it pisses the fuck out of me, because out of the 54 interventions that the US has done over the past 70 years, 52 have failed, millions have lost their lives, and just saying this is sometimes necessary and this is just a cause of war is absolute crap, and I'm not going to take it. Let's talk about the issues in this debate. I'm going to extend on efficiency later on, but let's talk about culpability for a bit. One, they have a role fulfillment obligation, so people have voted them in, they must carry out the people's will. This is atrocious logic. Let's assume Palestinian people chose Hamas to come in, would that mean that Hamas should and then Palestinian people were also like really anti-Semitic nuts? Does that mean that everything that Hamas that does then is justified? Like, just because your population is war crazy doesn't mean that everything that you do is justified. If your population has like criminal tendencies, which I'm pretty sure the American population doesn't, you don't owe that duty. But secondly, I'd also say, even if the Senate does it, you're the last signatory. You can choose not to go to war. You're the commander-in-chief. So I'm pretty sure that there's some culpability there. The third thing they say is, oh, well, there's a series, there's command and stuff. So people on the ground do it. I would know that one, as Taha pointed out in the POI, if the US military has historically been doing this for a really, really long period of time, something must be really, really wrong. And that has to do with top brass. So clearly the people on the ground who can fire shoot 5 bullets or 5 civilians, yes, they matter, but I would presume that the person who starts a war on something that is fake information and then proceeds to carpet bomb cities is probably one who should be held to account much more. The third thing they say is, well, there's lots of circumstances. I'm pretty sure those circumstances can come up in trial, like in any single fucking criminal trial in history, and we can probably factor this into the punishment that we can get. I'm really not sure why they must be 100% culpable for them to just be prosecuted. We just need to show a degree of culpability, and I think that should be fine. And the last thing I want to note is, regardless of however difficult and messy war is, rules of war, regardless of who's in the war, should remain the same for everyone. War, I'm pretty sure, is pretty messy for lots of African states. It's also pretty messy for Asian states. But if they're going to be held to that standard, I'm pretty sure that the US should be as well, because all of their case on culpability also, by the way, applies to every single African dictator who's being prosecuted by the criminal court. They can say the same thing. People on the ground did it. It was a momentary decision. I did not have time. My population wanted to do it. Then who would you prosecute? Nobody. Then do fuck all. Now let's talk about like efficiency and win this. I would talk about two reasons for why this will probably work out. And I will also note that even though we won't get like every single US president who's probably a war criminal prosecuted and convicted, we will probably get one conviction specifically. For that, we probably need some justification of why this is the ideal time for us to do this. The first thing to note is, this is the ICC doing it in 2022, where the Biden regime is in power. One, Biden's not launched a war yet, so he's probably not concerned about war criminal, about being accused of war crimes. That's the first thing, and that also takes out the attack of, oh, the US president's concerned that something happens to them in the future. Probably Biden doesn't. The second thing is, Biden also has this thing where he has an easy target. So while Biden might not be willing to give up information on Obama, I would suggest that Biden would be very happy to give up information on Trump, somebody who signed off on the attack on Qasem Soleimani, somebody who let war criminals go and gave them a presidential pardon. I'm pretty sure he'll be able to do it, and he'll probably get lots of Republicans on his side as well, given that the Republican Party is trying to divorce itself from Trump. The third thing I would note is Biden and the US is trying to reintegrate into the international system after the fucking misery that Trump put the US in and its international relations in. What does this mean? I think that this means that they're much more likely to appease international institutions as opposed to pick fights with them, especially international institutions which have a huge presence and operation in Africa. When African countries en masse are saying that the ICC is a racist institution, I would probably say that one way in which you can bring African countries towards yourself and make them much more happier than they are right now with you is by opening up yourself and past US presidents to the same degree of accountability that their presidents and their dictators are facing. I would also know that Africa is kind of important for the US in terms of Chinese influence in Africa because of the BRI is rapidly increasing. So therefore, there is an international relations reason for Biden to care as well. The third thing I would note is lots of these presidents are old and are not relevant to US politics at all. So it's also pretty easy for us to do this. By the way, in terms of the ICC, I would know that the ICC is a rational actor, so they probably won't pick the most unlikely person to be sentenced to prosecute. They will probably pick the easiest person to prosecute because of two reasons. One, they will probably want a PR win in case that they actually win. Two, they're operating under resource constraints, so they can't go for like extremely long, lengthy trials for a president in which the US won't comply. So they probably pick and choose the case where the US is likely to comply, as opposed to the cases where the US is not likely to comply at all. The third thing I would note is, even if the US doesn't comply, there are two things that happen as soon as you open up prosecution and investigation. One, as noted by OG, but I'll use this in this framework. The ICC has its own investigative processes, so you can get information there. But two, I would know that one, if you start a case on a US president, this is the topic for every single media organization in the world. They are sending people to gather evidence within these territories, ask witnesses, find witnesses to enable this prosecution to work. So we think that lots of witnesses are likely to come forward, given how much misery the US has inflicted on the world. I'll take O.
Warrants can be used to demand evidence, which the US is more likely to agree to than giving generals, and the countries where the crimes happen are very happy to provide their evidence and witnesses. This, alongside the fact that the US already extradites its generals, means we get evidence and accountability on both sides without having to incur the unique harms on OO. This responds to both CG and OG.
Cool. Which general who launched the war on terror has been prosecuted? Like this idea that every single general who's committed war atrocities in the US is automatically taken over by the US internal system, and the US is very happy to share information is just fucking ridiculous. Given the scale of war crimes that have happened. If that was happening, then we wouldn't be having this debate, because the US military would have changed how it operated. After the media, I'd also talk about the second thing, which is whistleblowing. I would know that whistleblowing is a very risky activity with very few upsides right now, whereby the US will prosecute you, blah, blah, for giving up information. I would say that people who are within the White House or who are part of the military are much more likely to come up with this information, given that they can also access things like witness protection, which they otherwise couldn't. Why is this crucial? This is not only crucial for accessing all of OG's impacts in terms of getting better trust into the ICC and actually holding people accountable. I would know that this is better in terms of how the US military in and of itself operates. Because if the fucking US president can be prosecuted, every general, every fucking soldier will be shitting their pants and saying, we are up next.
Thank you very much